at all. That culture was also part of the Latin culture, so although it might have been less prevalent in Italy, it was still there. I went on the Italian eBay because Italian sounds almost like French, so I can naturally sort of understand it, and using Google Translate, I looked on for stuff for half an hour. I could find next to no antiques. So either they do not have a culture of selling it, or they simply have not kept it because even if not as much of it was destroyed, because they did not as much follow that thing of destroying after the person has died, they still probably had it a lot because it is a Latin place. France, especially the northern parts of France where I am from and where most antiques would have survived from, was more influenced by Britain. It was more Britain-like than Latin-like. France is really both Latin and North, both southern, and north in terms of geographically speaking. It is as much as in the north of Europe, like Britain and all, as it is in the south. I'm obviously from the north of France, so technically from the north of Europe, the south part of the north of Europe. People who are from my father's place, southernmost, these antiques become more rare because the culture was way more Latin, and thus they would also throw the stuff afterwards. And also people had less money there usually, so they acquired less things, and then if the few items they acquired, they get rid of it, probably burn it, that was the culture after the person dies. To get it, nothing has survived. So probably all these Latin influenced countries, which were heavily influenced by Spain or Latin places. By the by, Latin is not really a breed or anything, it simply means the language spoken. So French, technically speaking, initially was a Latin language. The modern French, especially of the northern areas, even of Palace and all, which initially is the French of Brittany, when Brittany was conquered, so initially it was the northern French, is now equally mixed with Germanic, almost equally mixed with Germanic elements. So that is the reason for which some people do not count the French as Latins, especially the French people like me, who talk French, which is highly influenced by English and even Germanic, to a lot of degrees. So by Latin it means that these are countries that are speaking as a major tongue, as a mother tongue, either Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. Portuguese and Spanish are almost identical, or what is the other one? Or Colombian and Venezuelan, which really come from Portuguese or Spanish, because all these places were, remember, obviously colonized throughout centuries, and succeedingly colonized again and again by people from Spain and Italy, and they brought that culture with them and their language, and thus they are known as Latin people. A Mexican person is known as a Latin, although he physically looks not much like an Italian, and yet they have a similar culture and especially speak a similar tongue because of colonization. So an Italian might look more like an Englishman, but his language is completely different and his culture is way more different. So, in all of those succeeding countries, Mexico, Spain, so I talked about Italy, and Spain and Portugal. Now the countries they colonized, so in other words, what is known as Latin America, the southern part, so not the southern part of the US, but the southern part of the entire continent of America. There are thousands of countries there, from the top of my head, I mean, Venezuela, Colombia, of Mexico, Haiti, I think, or Haiti is a bit, Haiti, Hawaii Island, which is actually part of the United States, but they have a different thing, and Brazil. They will have had a similar culture of burning the clothing after the person had died. And also, back in those days, even in the late 19th century, when there were obviously more middle classes and upper middle class and even upper classes, there were still far fewer than in Western Europe. On top of that, today these countries are way less well-to-do. So they do not really have eBays, they do not have Etsy's. Are you going to go to those countries to go in the cheap bazaars to hopefully find antiques? Those countries are dangerous, do not go in cheap bazaars and stuff. I would never set foot in those countries and see what happens there. So you should not go, especially if you're lucky to come from Western Europe, stay in safe places. Do not get to those damn places, and even if you go to those damn places, it would be hard to find antiques. You would have to go to underground places where people speak hardly any English and learn their ugly tongues to be able to communicate with them. And then they would give you a white man's price Or even if you are black in English, they will give you an Englishman's price. They will say, he's brown like me, but he's clearly with more money from Britain, so we will give him a super expensive price. And it will not even be British clothing. It will have been constructed differently, but it will look like, to some extent, at least what the upper middle classes and even to some extent the middle classes and especially upper classes wore would have been very similar to at least what the Europeans as a wore, not precisely the British men. Now, about Central Asia and Eastern Europe, these are different places, and are more like what was going on in Europe, because first of all, more and less alike, it depends. Those places follow the same path, in the sense that today, it depends. For the Central Asian places, although the race there is exactly the same than in many instances, to have many races there. I like to have many races in Europe now, but in many instances it is exactly like my race and stuff. Their culture was very different, and only a few minority of people dressed remotely alike in suits and all. Most of them still wore the what you might call traditional dress. I sort of call it as their own fashion because it's also evolved through decades. Likewise it did in Western Europe, but it simply was nothing alike because they had a culture of really peasantry, so they would not wear suits. So it was like in China, like they had a different thing in China. So it was not like a Chinese thing, but it was simply a different thing of Central Asia. Or Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe depends. Think the far end of Eastern Europe, or the southern end of Eastern Europe, and then Central Asia. That would be the case there. And so fewer people would be middle class, fewer even upper middle class, and fewer even upper classes. And then, especially the more one goes up to middle class, the middle class would either wear complete peasant dress or nothing to do with European dress. At least nothing to do with European British suits. Or would mix it, and maybe the upper middle class would still wear the suit and all, but mix it so the suit would have construction techniques far different, and especially in style it would be different. It would be mixed. They might wear a local hat, local footwear, so on and so forth, or local decorations on top of the suit. And even that up for the upper classes. Obviously for the upper classes it might have been less so, especially when one goes not really to Eastern Europe, more to, sorry, not to Central Asia, but more to Eastern Europe, places like what today have become Ukraine, Russia, at least the eastern, sorry, the western part of Russia, the western, what was known as the Imperial Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, parts of Hungary is in Eastern Europe, Hungary, and I will talk about Hungary in a different stage because it is a different culture, but Poland, Croatia, how do you pronounce it? It's Czechoslovakia. It was named Czechoslovakia, now it is named Czech Republic. And other places, what are they? Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, Croatia, Slovenia, those places. Then, Imperial Russia was Imperial Russia, so they had their own thing, and usually it was very close to what the Europeans wore, except it had more layers and especially fur because it was so cold there. Especially what the upper classes wore. What the upper middle class wore, there were few upper middle class compared to Europe, but what they wore was very much alike. But they did still, unlike the upper classes, and mix it with more local elements. But now the problem is also how to find these garments, how to find Turkmenistan garments from 1890s. See how hard it is to find British garments, or the Britain in percent to the population, and in percent to how much of those garments had been made. In other words, for example, how much men's garments had been made between the years 1890 and 1900. Britain would be the country where the highest amount of those garments most likely has survived. It seems like the United States has more. I will come to that later on, but no, it is Britain. In percent, I'm not talking in actual numbers, but in percent. So even how hard it is to find British garments from that era, how to find Turkmenistan garments, did they keep those garments? The few upper middle classes and upper classes that actually wore that, have they survived? And if they have survived, are they not simply just in museums, local museums back there, you do not even know they exist, and or are they even for sale? And if they are for sale, they do not have an eBay, they do not have local shops like that. You might have to go there, you would have to